My name is Konrad Schmid. I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism at the University of Zurich. There is no question, the fall of Jerusalem is a central topic in the Hebrew Bible. It is explicitly dealt with in the book of Jeremiah, which is the longest book of the Bible, the book of Lamentations, the books of Kings, and its parallels in Chronicles. Implicitly, the loss of the state and the temple also affects the Pentateuch. The laws are given outside the land. The sanctuary in the Pentateuch is construed as a mobile tent, and besides the very modest regulations in Deuteronomy 17, a king for Israel and Judah does not play a role, and the foundational history of Israel does not result in the establishment of a kingship. In historical terms, these features point to the conclusion that the Pentateuch is, in terms of its content, a text which in central parts seems to be informed by the fall of Jerusalem. The Pentateuch is the Magna Carta of an exilic Israel. Of course, there are many materials in the Pentateuch that predate the Babylonian exile, but the overall shape of the Pentateuch is very much affected by the fall of Judah and Jerusalem. But let's return to the more explicit texts in Jeremiah and Lamentations. Although some or even most of the texts of these books seem to presuppose a setting around the time of the fall of Jerusalem, in methodological terms, this is in the first place only a judgment about the world of the narrative, not of the world of the narrators. Some texts in Jeremiah and Lamentations may indeed be contemporaneous with the depicted world of the narrative. Others might be later reinterpretations that, however, employ the overall scenery of the books. How did the intellectuals in Jerusalem that are responsible for the production of the biblical literature react to the fall of Jerusalem? We are in a position to quite exactly determine the tradition historical mindset of that time. We can, for instance, learn from Psalm 48 that Zion, God's holy mountain in Jerusalem, is a safe place that cannot be conquered by anyone because of God's own presence there. The same can be induced from the early Isaiah tradition. Jerusalem is a safe place because it is the city of God. And in the book of Jeremiah, this position is taken up by the prophet Hananiah in Jeremiah 28. In theory, the fall of Jerusalem is, therefore, simply impossible. And probably the people in Jerusalem were even more convinced of that due to the sparing of Jerusalem in the crisis of 701 BCE, when Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, but in the end he went away without conquering it. So, in theory and in practice, Jerusalem was safe in the eyes of the Jerusalemites. When the Neo-Babylonians managed 2 times in a series in 597 and 587 to conquer Jerusalem, this was a shock and an unprecedented theological challenge. Something happened which was not only not supposed to happen, but which was deemed to be impossible to happen. A very good illustration for this attitude can be found in the book of Lamentations, chapters 4, verse 12. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. No one believed it, but it happened. At this point in the history of ancient Israel and Judah, one of the most astonishing intellectual developments start in order to cope with this factual experience that was not supposed to have taken place. Given the vanishing of the religions of Israel's and Judah's neighbors in the wake of their military conquests by different ancient Near Eastern empires, this is actually what was to be expected. The God of Jerusalem would have to demise. But the Judean intelligentsia, deported or not deported, decided to go for other concepts. And we can find these concepts documented especially in the books of Jeremiah, Lamentations, and Kings, but also otherwise in the Hebrew Bible. A first reaction to the fall of Jerusalem can be found in the laments over Jerusalem in the oldest passages of the book of Jeremiah and in the biblical book of Lamentations. They address the city of Jerusalem, which is conceived as a woman in pain and sorrow who has been abandoned by their lovers. Especially the book of Jeremiah uses very strong imagery and language, claiming that Jerusalem was adulterous and whored away from its Lord. We know these metaphors from ancient Near Eastern literature. The imagery of a marriage between a god and his city is quite common, and in that framework, adultery denotes alliances of cities with foreign powers. In the case of Jerusalem, this was apparently the case with the reach-outs to Egypt, which took place shortly before the catastrophe, as we can infer from texts like Ezekiel 17. So this first reaction actually remained within the framework of the traditional religious system. Jerusalem is safe because of its God, but because Jerusalem did not trust in its God, but tried to build up other alliances, especially with Egypt, God gave up on Jerusalem. Nevertheless, this first reaction to the fall opened up a line of thinking which became very prominent in the Hebrew Bible. It explained the fall of Jerusalem by the apostasy of the kings and the people. It was not only the wrong alliances, but the wrong worship over the past centuries that eventually caused the catastrophe. This position is prominently anchored both in the book of Kings and in Jeremiah, and in scholarship the texts that advance this position are usually termed to be Deuteronomistic, because they use language and concepts similar to be found in the book of Deuteronomy. These texts are not completely uniform in terms of their ideology. They address different subjects as being responsible for the fall of Jerusalem. If we look at the book of Kings, then it is clearly discernible that at least the four last kings after Josiah are evaluated completely negatively. And it was because of their apostasy that Jerusalem eventually fell. But there are also other texts like 2 Kings 17 and, if we look for a moment beyond the book of Kings, Exodus 32, which clearly state apostasy and faulty cultic behavior was not only an issue of the kings, but the whole people sinned. Possibly this move from assigning guilt to the people instead of to the kings arose in a second generation after the loss of kingships. Thus, it is possible to uncover a broad discourse about how the fall of Jerusalem was being interpreted, including positions regarding the guilt of the city, the king, and the whole people. Of course, these speculations had a strong impact on the religion of ancient Judah. God no longer served as a guarantor for national, political, and economical stability, but he got his own religious agenda that included the possibility of destroying his own city and the main institutions of Judah. But also in broader terms, the notion of God changed dramatically in ancient Judah. In monarchic times, it was a common notion that God dwells in his temple, as it is explicitly said, for instance, in Isaiah 6. Texts presupposing the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple seem to develop a new notion. God no longer is bound to his temple, but he dwells in heaven. So, for instance, in 1 Kings 8, verse 22. A final element I would like to discuss is the different notion of kingship that arose in the wake of the fall of Jerusalem. Pre-exilic texts often exhibit a double notion of kingship. The real king is God himself, and he has a vassal king in Jerusalem who is more directly in charge of his people. The book of Isaiah is very familiar with the notion of God as king, but of course also speaks of the kings of Judah, and there is no contradiction between those concepts. In the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, with the demise of Davidic kingship, basically three options arose. The first one was to expect a new Davidic king, especially in Jeremiah, for example, chapter 23, and in Ezekiel, chapter 34, but also in other prophetic books, this stance was being taken. The second one was to claim that also foreign kings can serve as a mundane representative of God. This position is most obviously expressed by Deutero-Isaiah. In Isaiah 45, the Persian king Cyrus can be designated as God's Messiah, and a similar concept can be found in some strands of the book of Jeremiah that speak of Nebuchadnezzar as God's servant in Jeremiah 25, 27, and 29. The third option would be to drop the institution of a national kingdom altogether and to speak only of God as the one and real king. Especially the fourth and the fifth books of Psalms think in that direction, but also Chronicles or the so-called priestly code in the Pentateuch have to be mentioned here. These texts are responsible for the developing the notion of a theocracy, which became so prominent in later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but which in fact owes its existence to the fall of Jerusalem.